Yeah.
Welcome everyone to Charcha 2021, co-hosted by the Nudge Forum and Media Network India. My name is Nandan Shurla. I'm really excited to have a very interesting panel with us today. I can go around the room and do a quick introduction. Divya leads Ajivika's policy work, engages with various stakeholders from industry to government. She's a Fulbright scholar, has a public administration degree from the Harvard Kennedy School. Rajesh is the co-founder and CEO of Socrates, an organization that seeks to be a very interesting word, the midwife of collective wisdom. Socrates cultivates minds that solve wicked problems such as climate change using cognitive science, data, and design. Ritvika and I go back almost a decade, and she's the CEO of Swaniti Initiative, a nonprofit that delivers development solutions to government officials in India. CEO, a role focuses on developing long-term growth strategies and formulating key partnerships with Indian central and state government bodies. Before Swaniti, Ritvika was working at the World Bank and also has a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. She's been a Forbes 30 and the 30 Young Global Leader at the World Economic Forum, and a special invitee to a workhouse for her work on social enterprise. And last but not the least, we have Tikender Singh Panwa, who is the former deputy mayor of Shimla, directly elected. The city has been able to create a vision with the development plan that speaks about inclusive growth, greater planned social infrastructure, and making the citizens in the city resilient. I think Tikender did a lot of interesting work in the environment and ecology space, as those are his areas of interest. Through his work, Shimla developed a model for democratic decentralization. Tikender has also been in the National Task Force to review the 74th Constitutional Amendment. So really excited to have all of you join us. Thank you again. I think this is an important sort of discussion to sort of get us started. Maybe I can request all of you to maybe in just a quick 1 or 2 minutes to identify or to share what you think of is the marginalized in a city, and who are they, what do they look like, and what are some of the problems that they face. Rajesh, could we go with you first?
Wait, give me 1 sec while I can learn how to turn this off. Yeah. Thank you, Nandan, and thank you everyone for this lovely panel. So I'll tell you where we are coming from in Socrates, which is that, as the name suggests, there is a strong connection to what we call wisdom traditions, philosophy and things like that on one side, and real change. So, philosophy not just as a way of studying the world, but how to change it. And citizenship is where we started our understanding of what happened to migrants during the pandemic and in the last 18 months more generally. And what we are really trying to understand is, how does something like citizenship really play out on the ground? And I want to give you a story that so we started by just interviewing migrants in various locations, what their experience has been. So what is their experience of citizenship? And one of them said to us, "Hum 50% ke nagrik hain." And so not totally voiceless, so not absent, but also not fully present. And so how can this 50% ka nagrik become a 100% ka nagrik is the challenge that I think we all face, especially as a democratic country that wants to grant full citizenship to all its inhabitants. So that is really the challenge that we are facing. And maybe later on I can talk a little bit about this program called Janta Ka Faisla that we have run to sort of really dig deep into how this might be enacted. But I'll stop here for the moment. You're muted, Nandan.
Yeah, I don't think we can hear Nandan, but maybe he's calling on me. So
Yeah. So thank you, Nandan, and thank you for this opportunity to be here. So I work with Ajivika Bureau, and we've been working for the past 15 years with seasonal migrant communities who go between the states of Rajasthan and Gujarat, Maharashtra to earn their livelihoods. Of course, it's only last year that this community really, captured the imagination of the public, the policymakers, and lots of other stakeholders in the development sector. But so I think there is a need to look at the issues that migrant workers are facing currently, and what they face, what came to light last year, in a very structural, systemic way. Because these, what we saw last year, what we saw exploding last year, were only the the fault lines, or only the symptoms of a much larger, deeper issue in the ecosystem. So I think that's where Ajivika Bureau is focused on, in terms of addressing those very structural, systemic kind of inequalities through various services, but most importantly, mobilizing migrant workers themselves from the ground, in order to make sure that their voices are heard in different platforms of policy, and even industry. So collaborations with the industry that we have forged in the recent past, that I would like to bring up later when we talk about some potential solutions. So yeah, maybe I'll stop here. Thank you, and looking forward. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Divya. Ritvika, would you like to go next?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me here today, and really appreciate your time. Uh, in regards to what we saw last year with the migrant crisis that was taking place, I think that was really highlighting to what I think what Divya and Rajesh said. Fault lines that had existed all along, but it just got really pronounced in a very short amount of time. And so, what you always saw was the fact that, when it comes to a lot of public services, when it comes to delivery of programs, there's a cohort of the society which is kind of missed out, and we kind of know that they're missed out. And what we all believed was that we had time to help them overcome this gap. At Swaniti, which is a social enterprise which supports governments on technical assistance to help the most vulnerable in those schemes, the intent is to do that, is to help provide services in of the most marginalized. But when you have a pandemic, and I think this was last year and then again this year, you suddenly have a very short amount of time when you have to get your act together. And if you're not able to get it together in that short time, you suddenly see how pronounced the issues are. And what you saw in the migrant crisis was that pronounced issue, was the fact that when it comes to social safety nets, when it comes to protection, we have a little bit more work to do, and I'm kind of underplaying it significantly when I say a little bit more work to do. But the larger point is that I think it highlighted the need for civil society, government, private sector to all come together to remedy that crisis. And I think that the problems were evident, but then in a very short amount of time, we also saw the solution become more evident, that no one entity can handle this issue. And given the scale of the problem, we all will need to work collaboratively. And I'm sure, Nandan, that as the panel moves forward, we'll talk about this collaborative effort to overcome the gap that exists, particularly with this cohort.
Oh, very well said, Ritvika. Thanks again. Tikender?
I don't think that I have to say much in the beginning because I'll speak once I have to make the presentation. But mark my words, Nandan, and thank you for inviting me, first of all, and the entire team. But actually, the kind of models that we are implementing, and probably what Divya said, it's quite systemic. And these are completely unsustainable. Mark my words. The SDGs are going to falter very soon, and then we'll realize down the line some new SDGs will be coined. And the pandemic and the lockdown, and especially this reverse migration, just expose the hollowness of the way we are building our cities. It is completely unsustainable. I mean, I'm quite underneath is the humongous amount of inequity that exists, which further gets compounded by the manner in which policies have been framed in the last 40 years, which I'll try to build that argument, and how governance, and there's a dialectical unity and struggle between governance and you know the kind of models that we are, and both there is no, I mean, both are not comment, I mean, there's no congruity in it, and that's why you have this foolish model of the SPVs and all. I mean, further alienating. There's a complete kind of alienation that I would say. Well, I'll try to, and since I come from a city's perspective where I have served the city for 5 years, so probably I'll share some of those those anecdotal experiences. The Indian way of governance, the Jugaad system. How does the city work actually? Apart
Yeah.
from what
So in fact, maybe we can just jump right into that, because my next question also would have been to you. It was, you were elected, uh,
yeah,
you enter the city government.
yeah.
What happened? It's as basic as that question. Once you came in, were you inspired? What were some of the problems that you were? How did you what was really happening? Was it, were you confused? Did you have access to information? Did you have the support that you needed, to really get, uh, to really get your hands dirty very quickly?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Because what happened, the first file that came to my office was privatized water. I said, what the hell is this? I mean, I've fought all through my life privatizing the utilities, and all of a sudden, under the ages of a very, I don't want to name them, that doesn't sound good, but one of the multilateral institutions, that and we didn't allow that. And actually, that is where we learned our first lesson that, uh, we have to build layers of inclusivity. And I do not know how many of our listeners are aware, but I was in a kind of different system because I was radically elected. Both the mayor and I came from a particular political thought. So, but we didn't have a majority in the council. So, out of 25 councillors, we just had two from my party, and 23 were from the opposition. And imagine, I was running a house. I mean, both of us, we were together running a house for 5 years, and just once we went for voting. I mean, when we were defeated, which of course we were bound to be defeated, but that's how we've been able to do. But let me tell you, Nandan, I mean, the city governments have virtually been turned into adjuncts of the provincial government, and nothing more than that. And let me also build that layer. I mean, if you allow me to do that, I think one of the reasons, the important reasons, is that never probably. I'm just getting this pop message. Can I just take? Yeah, later maybe. Huh?
Go ahead, Tikendra. That will
Yeah.
just keep coming on.
So actually, if you see, I mean, why so profoundly obsessed with the fact that the way and the manner in which we are building our cities is completely inequitable. I mean, it's not going to lead us to the desired goals of SDGs. It gets further substantiated and further concretized with my work in 5 years in working in the city government, and that's what I'll try to build. So and I go back to some 32, 35 years when the first urban commission. So actually, we have to traverse this journey from the first urban commission, which was headed by Charles Correa. And if you see the first urban commission, the direction of the commission was that, look, cities are going to be manufacturing hubs. So, you plan a city for where manufacturing is going to take place at a very large scale. But what we have witnessed in the last few decades is that actually manufacturing has declined substantially. And there's huge amount of informality that has crept in. It's almost 94%, from 75% to 94%. And there, when you were asking, where are they? They're everywhere, by the way. I mean, I go cycling in the morning from my place because I moved to Delhi now, from Delhi to Sriford, and you find hundreds and hundreds of these black bicycle riders. I mean, they are they're gardeners. There are all sorts of people. They're washermen. They are domestic help and whatnot. I mean, so they're everywhere, by the way. So this huge informality has actually got further added in the last few decades. And what has also happened is their voice, in fact, their voice has been, and over the period of time, got completely decimated, if I could say so. Because early in the manufacturing period, when you have these large cotton mills, just imagine Bombay of 1970s and 1980s, you had the huge bargaining power of the working people vis-a-vis the state, or vis-a-vis the different layers and structures of the state, than what you witness now. Because what do you expect from a Zomato tomato potato guys? I mean, who are roaming all around. I mean, and look at the way how they're being exploited. So, are we not aware of all this? We are. So I think that's one of the reasons where this bargaining power has got substantially eroded. That's the first thing. Okay, so the huge amount of informality that has creeped in. The second thing I think, which I am really fond of quoting, and that is from Ursula Hughes' famous essay. She wrote uh, some some years ago, and that is, in what political economy we call from use value to exchange value. This commoditization that has taken place at a very rapid pace. Take, for example, health, education. Now, how do I understand water? Is water a right or is water a need? I mean, things get segregated immediately. If it's a right, then I accrue certain this fundamental right from the state. But if it's a need, then there are a number of players, and we've seen this. Well, there are figures to quote, but there's humongous amount of actually accumulation of capital that has taken place by the privatization of these utilities in various cities. And unfortunately, post JNNURM, not I would not say after the first urban commission, when actually there was a holistic approach. After JNNURM, it was more for project oriented approach. So the city was considered to be, you have to just build those projects. So education is another important area where this humans. So if you just see the flow of accumulation of capital, there's a famous book written by Samuel Stein called The Capital City. I am not sure. Probably you are the one who can quote that on that. But in US, probably the primary source of accumulation takes place through real estate development. In India, I'm not sure how many cities and how many places the primary source of accumulation is taking place through real estate development. But yeah, definitely, because that's how, that's the lesson we were taught
Yeah.
after JNNU, that you have to be competitive,
So
competitive
essentially, the needs-based approach and accumulation of capital.
competitive cities,
Yeah.
and so more of land monetization, not realizing that, I mean, what kind of a town and city were you developing? And this actually further hit on whatever democratic decentralization we had after the 74th constitutional amendment. I mean, it's funny. I mean, it's not even funny. It's criminal, I would say. After say 26 years, when we created the 74th constitutional amendment, and we said 18 items under the 12th schedule were supposed to be passed on to the city governments. Do you know, Nandan, how many have been passed? Janagraha, I think they've done certain study. Priya had another study, some case studies that they've done. And you'll be shocked to note not more than two are universally passed on to the city governments. And guess what? So when you and I we are born, the birth certificate comes from the city government. And of course, this next happens to be the garbage collection. Rest, where is it? Who is planning the city? So when we talk about equitable cities, I think the whole process of reclaiming that right to plan. Now, what I'm doing right now here in Delhi is, and that comes from my anecdotal experience. I mean, you must watch some of those videos. I'm running a series on the Delhi master plan. Are you aware, Nandan? Nowhere in the country the cities are planned by the citizens. Of course, that doesn't mean that some machines plan that, but there's a definite tool method of planning those cities. So it's the Delhi Development Authority in Delhi, it's Mumbai Development Authority in Mumbai, it's the Bangalore Development Authority, and I am running the series for the Delhi Development Authority Master Plan 2041. The people's participation, 4 webinars in which I guess 100 people participated, and the population of Delhi is 2.3 or 2.4 crores. So I ran this series and I got innumerable calls from the village people and said, hey, we are also part of Delhi, please come. So I've taken that video and probably it will be uploaded, which you must watch.
Yeah.
The kind
Tikender,
of
can I just
no, last
can I
because last I mean,
quickly-
when we speak about inequity, the last thing, this huge amount of inequity also gets creeped in because the commons, the urban commons and the village commons that the people own, have so fast moved from them to various organizations. Could it be parastatal? Could it be large giants? And this is exactly what is happening in Delhi, where you find these village commons and they're completely gone. So actually, the problem is quite systemic. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is complete alienation of the people in the processes, and that's been done quite decisively. It's not that it happened, but it was deliberately done. And the last point in this, maybe I'll add about what could be the alternatives when I speak about my anecdotal experiences in Simla, is actually the model of the smart cities. It's like writing an obituary of the 74th Constitutional Amendment. Nandan. I mean, unfortunately, that is true. Where the elected councils are not even part of what should be done, and that's why you find these smart cities or the GNNURM, invariably all these cities are flooded because what they've done is they've not got the people on board, and they have actually ruined the water channels. They have ruined whatever was there, and all of a sudden you find cities like Patna, name the city which doesn't get flooded in these.
Yeah.
These are not the
Thank
successful ones. Yeah, so I think maybe
No
thanks.
worries. I think that was great context. And I think one of the big arguments that sort of comes up, and Ritvika, this is sort of addressed to you, is I feel is they say that governments don't have the capacity to be able to actually do some of this. Now, you've been working with state governments over the last decade or so. What has been your experience there? How interested are they in devolving powers? Is this, it's almost a chicken and egg problem, right? So in the sense, how do you think they're looking at it? And how much of this is a capacity issue?
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important question. See, one of the major issues which comes in is that we kind of focus as civil society, a lot of efforts end up going to the central government, and then it kind of goes down in terms of the scale. Here, case with the state. By the time you go to a district, a block, or a village, the number of civil society partners who come in, the kind of technical assistance which is required in
Nandan, can I just ask Ritika to be a little slow because I'm unable to follow. She's speaking so fast.
sorry,
I'm
sorry,
unable to,
I
yeah,
was
follow.
not twice as
A
loud
little,
and half as
I'm so
fast.
sorry, but please.
Yeah, not right. It's not twice as loud and half as fast, but I'm afraid I do the opposite.
Loud is not the problem, actually. You're speaking so fast, probably, the amplification is not, or maybe
Go ahead.
it's taking it a very high. Yeah,
Sure,
please.
I'll enunciate more. So essentially, when it comes to the contrast between the level of support from a civil society perspective that goes from a national level to a state level to a district level and down to a village and a block level, kind of depreciates when you go down each level in terms of the number of actors who are present and are willing to support in the Indian context. In the last few years, there's been a relative increase in the amount of technical assistance experts who do come in at a state and a district and a block level. But the need, as you rightly pointed out, is much more so because a lot of particularly public services that come in are executed at a state, at a district, at a block, at a village level, which is there. One of the reasons which I think culturally we are inclined to want to believe that so much decision making, particularly from a policy perspective, happens top down, that there is perhaps most merit in focusing on implementation, which is in providing support, which is top down, and somewhere we kind of forget the fact that we need to be more inclusive and bottom up. Now, I think when it comes to, if you look at the last few years, when it comes to devolution of funding, when it comes to the willingness of community-based organizations, of panchayati rajas, of kind of more localized governance, there has been a push to go bottom up, which is why you've also seen civil society come in. But I think there's this, again, I'll go back to Nandan, what you started the conversation with. If you look at the pandemic, what you notice is that a lot of decision making was left to the cities, and then cities really struggle to execute, or districts really struggle to execute, because there was not the requisite amount of support needed for flawless execution or even solid execution. They did, a lot of districts did the best that they could, but there were short staffed, there wasn't the knowledge base required, there weren't at certain point. I mean, we have teams in Jharkhand, and what we really felt was there just weren't enough people to do what needed to be done. Just like bodies on the ground, registering people, making sure that the requisite support that was needed. And so, even with the most brilliant officers, elected officials, even with the resources that were needed, when you have those gaps, it's really hard to overcome those gaps, and be able to deliver public service. So, coming back to your point, I think the issue which is there, and I think you implied this fairly strongly, is that there are limited resources as you keep going down each rung. And part of it is because culturally we're more inclined to kind of pay most attention to what is kind of the big picture, the nation, the state, and then kind of go down from there. there is a shift in terms of the culture of civil society organizations, of assistance happening more localized, but we need to move much more rapidly in that direction if we are to overcome these gaps.
Yeah. Thanks, Ritvika. Rajesh, I think sort of coming back to you, one of the first things that you see on the Socrates website is that we solve wicked problems. And I don't think there's probably a more wicked problem than sort of thinking about inclusivity of our cities. Towards this, what has been your experience? But before I sort of get you to answer, just want to get to the audience and say there's if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box. If you have any chat, feel free to mention this. We'll keep posting it on the group as and when it comes up. Yes, Rajesh, go ahead.
Sorry. So I'll start by giving an example of this kind of really difficult wicked problems that emerge in cities. So Bangalore, which is where I'm sitting in right now, has 198 wards, right? And wards can vary enormously. Now, a place where we are trying to do some, and for COVID in particular, one of the challenges has been to understand and then act upon the enormous amounts of vaccine skepticism that exists, right? But and this can be seen in many different ways, but this is fundamentally a problem of inclusivity, right? Because you have created, say, vaccination policies that have not taken local leadership into account. So now let's the ward in which we have done a little bit of work in Yeshwantpur, which is broadly speaking northwest Bangalore, you have a very strong Tamil community, in a Kannada-speaking state, and no outreach was done in Tamil, right? And yet you have it's a low-income housing development of maybe about 5,000 families, of whom I think sometime in July, maybe a third of the people had even thought about vaccination, let alone getting vaccinated. Right. So how do you do messaging? How do you make this inclusive? How do you get community leaders to be champions of a vaccination policy? Each one of these is a challenge in inclusive urban design that, of course, you try to crack open one of those aspects and all the others come connected with them. So how do you address them? How do you try to create a form of local governance that is very fine-grained, right? So it's not general political local governance. It's also something as fine-grained as, okay, you have an emergency, you have a new BBMP policy where you have a ward deter committee, but how do you get the members of that community to also be participate in the ward deter committee? How do they interact with the Janagrahas of the world so that they can learn from each other? I mean, these are the kinds of things I don't have a solution. So let me say this, that we have wicked problems, but we don't have any kind of magic bullet to address them. But I feel like we need very systematic ways of bringing knowledge that tries to address challenges of this kind, right? And so the good news is that we are seeing the emergence of new collectives that are trying to do exactly this, right? I think I was just scrolling through some of the chats from the previous session. I saw Srinivas was on the previous panel. And so the good news is that citizens who have been very active in making a city like Bangalore more inclusive are actually beginning to address these kinds of local governance challenges in a fine-grained manner.
Got it. No, thanks, Rajesh. In fact, I feel one of the reports that we did at ON India with one of our partners called Up the Institute, they identified the importance of the role of an intermediary in this, and the very important role they play as well, along with community leaders in ensuring that citizens have access to this.
So Apti is actually in that collaboration, I should say.
Correct. So I thought, Divya, maybe I could come to you, because the Jivika sort of plays this intermediary role in a very strong way. So I just want to get a sense of, number one, what do you think are sort of the priorities in terms of what works? Because I think Jivika's experience over the last few years is you've tried a bunch of different initiatives. Some of them have been successful, some of them have been not so successful. I want to get a sense of what do you think are the wildly successful initiatives that you think should be replicated across different geographies?
Sure. Yeah. So I think a lot of the solutions that have worked, at least from our perspective, are very context specific. So, for example, as Tikendra also explained at the beginning, informality is a major issue that really permeates all kinds of all aspects of life of migrant workers. So, I think one of our very successful initiatives have been providing legal aid to migrant workers, especially in terms of resolving wage disputes, in terms of enabling their access to social security schemes, in terms of enabling their access to urban entitlements, and really empowering them in different urban contexts in reaching out to urban local bodies. Because as you can imagine, really the issues of migrant workers were and are still on the periphery of the imagination of our urban development schemes. They're really on the margins, especially the ones that are seasonal and mobile, that really commute from rural areas to the cities and go back and forth. They're really on the fringes of the society, but also in the policy imagination of our, especially the urban policymakers. They're not really thought of as a constituency that's a legitimate presence in the cities, even though they are the ones really powering the cities. But I think so. One of the I would just quote an anecdote from one of our initiatives in Ahmedabad, where we were working with tribal migrants who come from the area from tribal areas in Gujarat like Dahod and Panchmahal, who come and work in the construction sector in Ahmedabad, but who live in open spaces. So they've been coming back and forth for 20 years, but they live in open spaces because they just haven't they undertake family migration. So they come in with the women who also work as workers in the construction industry, but they live in like an open space of land under flyovers on the road pavements where they just don't have any mechanism to establish a claim to the city. So one of the things that really worked in our context, so along with legal aid and legal awareness, legal literacy that we provide to migrants, we also mobilize them into worker collectives that are trade based, sometimes we concentrate or focus on employment related issues which have more to do with wages and attendance records and employee-employer relationships, but some of their pressing concerns are also about lack of access to entitlements. So the women group that got mobilized actually undertook a survey of themselves, and they took this statistics to the urban local body, the ward councillor there, and told them that, look, this is the number of people who don't have access to toilets in the morning. And what does that mean? That means that the women have to wake up as early as 3 a.m. in the morning to really just go out and defecate in the open, on the side of railway tracks, where some chowkidars of some housing societies might really beat them up and ask them to leave because they're making the place dirty, but they just don't have access to proper dignified toilet facilities. So they shared this with the local authorities that these are the things that we face. We don't have water. But they always see mobile water tankers and mobile toilets that the city really has, but these are just used for different purposes. So, for example, the mobile toilets are used for some events, some public events. But why don't you come and install it in our settlement so that we can use them? The water tankers are usually used for permanent kind of water connections if something goes wrong. So why don't the water tankers actually change route and come to our settlements and provide us with water on a weekly basis? So these were some initiatives that the community themselves undertook, that we facilitated, that really worked in our context. So yeah, some things that don't work are of course also have to deal with the bureaucracy and the general sort of attitude of some state governments towards migrant workers and towards their role in the city. So we have also received a lot of pushback when we try to advocate for entitlements by saying that why do migrants expect the destination state to solve their problems? Why do they come here? We are already providing them with employment. What more do you expect from them? So I think it's always been a mixed experience, but yeah, I think that probably answers your question.
Got it. So I think now is a good time to probably sort of put the poll question, which is really just as a follow-up on this point, really, which is who is the most important intermediary between the marginalized and the city-state government? And I'll get Tikendra to comment on this as well in a bit. We'll have a bunch of votes come in right now, but
Who is the Of course, the elected representatives. I'll share three anecdotes, Nandan, if you permit me.
Go ahead.
Okay, I mean, how exclusive this entire process of urban governance is. Now, and when I say democratic decentralization, I do not mean empowerment of the elected institutions. Of course, that is important, over your bureaucracy. That's the first thing. The second thing is actually the people have to decide. People have to be empowered, So we have to build those processes and layers, as they were pointing out. And actually, if that is not happening, then and you will be surprised. And that's the first anecdote that I'm going to share. Who happens to be one of the impediment or an hindrance to people's empowerment? Guess who in the city? It's the elected representative at times, most of the times. So how do you, and that I'll share those three anecdotal experiences. The first thing is when we were trying to construct houses for there was a scheme called the basic services for urban poor. Okay, so already land was decided, and we had to construct some 250 or 300 houses. I'm not sure, but I think more than 250. Yeah. So the and symbolized on the mountain. So it was supposed to be constructed on a mountain, on a hill. We were not able to. Now just try to understand. I mean, these nuances you will not get it from anyone else. We had to shift the site for the simple reason that both the councillors. It's not prudent to name both the councillors and the wards here. Both the councillors felt that this is the land of the deity. Okay, because the deity happens to be very powerful in the mindset of mountain people, and most of the backward people would be Dalits. So Dalits, how can Dalits live on a hill that has a deity temple on the top? That is the kind of exclusion I'm talking about. That didn't come from somewhere else, but that came from the elected institution. And because we required their NOC and they did not provide, and we had to shift the site to another one of the slum areas. Of course, those houses were constructed, beautiful houses, but that's something that we have to understand. What does that mean? How do you break it? That's the first thing. The second thing is what Divya was also pointing out, the most vulnerable tribals and the Muslims. And Muslim migrants, it's so difficult to get them whatever is desired. And I still remember when I was not the deputy mayor before that, innumerable struggles with the district administration, because we have these Kashmiri porters who visit some land. These porters are visiting like since last more than 100 years, maybe 150 years. The Britishers brought them because they're the porters. No? Every house is not connected through the road, so you have to carry a load on your back. So just to get them registered as a voter is a very big question. I think that's a very big question for our migrant people. I think that is what I remember. I mean, a number of struggles and whatnot. I mean, you understand. The third thing which actually concerns you is, and that's why I pointed out, I mean, the elected institution. I mean, when I say democratic decentralization, because the kind of thought that we came, we said, no, this is not the way how we can run the city. So we said, we'll go back to the 74th constitutional amendment that focuses on the ward sabhas. So we will only approve a file of the ward councillor if it is approved from the ward, so which means the ward creates a plan. And there was massive hindrance from the councillor. They said, no. And I told you after 25, 23 were opposition councillors. Okay. They said, how can you do that? We said, it's the constitutional framework. So there was a logjam for 2 months, 3 months. We said, because the budget had to be approved from us. So they had to bear that. And we had to bear them. Eventually, the ward sabhas took place for the first time in the history of Simla Municipal Corporation. And you cannot imagine the kind of creativity and what people say, that people don't have the capacity. They have massive capacity, in fact, at the ward level. And that's why we got the first prize in the country, because in the NPDRR, because Shimla Atlas is known as one of the models in which how you should measure your vulnerability apart from building your plans. So yeah, so that happened, and that's how things started disseminating, but these ward sabhas had to take place every 6 months. And 6 months down the line, we find Nandan. I mean, that's the practical experience I'm telling you. The same signatures were fudged by the councillors without holding those ward sabhas, and again brought back, with a new kind of plan, which was not approved from the people, but which the councillor, and 60 to 70%. I mean, I'm just monitoring the Bombay Municipal Corporation election that is going to take place next year. Can you imagine what a prospective councillor is going to spend on the election? Just give me a wild guess. it's normally 2 CR. Now, if 2 crores is to be spent, it's what I'm telling you. I mean, it's frankly speaking, don't, I mean, that's the reality if they have to win. So if 60% of them are either proxy contractors. How do you break this jinx if we talk about equitable land? I think it's more democratization and more institutionalization of that democratization. So
Ritvika, I
when
think,
this fudging happened, the last thing, when this
yeah.
fudging happened, so one of the models that we created, and I don't know whether that they still continue with that model anymore or not, we said 10% of the total revenue that gets generated from a ward will go to the ward sabha, not to the ward councillor. The councillor happens to be the chairperson of the ward. But if we create those creativity within the system, so 10% means huge amount. I mean, if say you're collecting 10 crores in a ward in terms of water, in terms of sanitation, whatever the municipal corporation gets, if 10% is disseminated straight away to the ward sabha, just imagine the kind of empowerment and the kind of plans and works that they can undertake, and then it can be further added with the employment guarantee that we intend to work on in days to
Yeah.
come. So I think that creativity is required if we have to break that jinx. Else, we are doomed, I'm telling you. Smart city
True.
alienation, and even the elected institutions do not provide, but they are far better than the smart city one, definitely. But I told you, I mean, 60%, 70% are like proxy contractors. They have interest in the budget. No, I've seen that. I've seen this closely. To break that jinx, people have to reclaim, and I think there have to be structures that we have to like Rajesh was speaking, the collectives, in number of forms in which we have to function. I think that's
Yeah.
it.
Ritvika, I think I want to pick up from this point that Tikendra just made right now, which is essentially we might go on talking about inclusivity, but unless the migrants, unless Dalits, unless women, whoever we want to define as the marginalized here, have political um, access, have a political say, are politically relevant, no change will happen because they will continue to be ignored by the political class. So you've written a book called "Making of a Politician." I think it Tikendra's point that he says it takes 2 crores to fight a municipal election is probably not a surprising number for you. So the quick question there is, number one, how do we get them to be politically relevant as a vote bank? Because I think addressing that, many argue, is the first step towards inclusivity.
Sure, absolutely. So I'll just take one quick step back and digress a little bit from your question, just for a couple of seconds. You said the question is framed as who's the most important intermediary. I think it's also a question of who's the most efficient intermediary in the context of delivering public services for the most marginalized. And I feel like one constituent that is missing is the bureaucracy, because you see the elected representative, the NGO, and the leaders certainly play a very important role, but when it comes to the delivery, it is going to end up being the bureaucracy that also plays a very critical role, especially within cities. And I think, going back a little bit to the last question, when it comes to the arms and legs of actually executing what needs to be done in a city, it's important to also support them in their efforts. So one of the systemic issues, which I think is kind of flawed, is we saw this during the lockdown. You had a lot of migrant workers reaching out and calling MPs and MLAs and saying, "Sir, madam, मेरे क्या घर पे पैसा पहुंच चुका है?" And then the MP or the MLA would end up calling the DM and saying, "आप थोड़ा देखेंगे पैसा पहुंचा है कि नहीं?" Then the DM would end up calling the block officer and saying, "देखिए घर जाके क्या हो रहा है." So what ended up happening was the front facing of what you see is the elected representative, but the machinery that has to push the public service is the bureaucracy. And so we end up kind of really trying to figure out the levers to support the elected representative. The NGO kind of looks at the elected representatives and says, "You are accountable, so you need to deliver better," as does the community leader. But a lot of the execution ends up being on the bureaucratic side. So I think we should really engage that important constituency, that important stakeholder when it comes to capacity building and when it comes to thinking through what do we need to do to have the most marginalized receive the support that they need. Very quickly coming back to your question, I think when it comes to the recognizing how do you get the most marginalized, the kind of simple answer to that in a very complex system is mobilizing and organizing as one united voice, in terms of having public services represented. That's what we've seen consistently happen. But for a lot of marginalized communities, that happens already. If you look at community leaders, if you look at a lot of what we call, I would say, vulnerable communities, whether that's minority communities, whether that's more of the weaker sections, you notice that there are community representatives of these kind of sections who come out and who are supposed to represent that interest to elected representatives. So you will find, for example, most recently, a lot of women leaders who come out and who say, I represent the women voices and I represent all of these SHG women. But the problem that becomes is that doesn't translate into public services, because the fundamental system of delivering those public services is still a little flawed. And so being able to strengthen that, so I don't think that the issue comes down in terms of our lack of representation of marginalized voices. It comes into translating the demands of those marginalized voices to actual services on the ground, and our perception that elected representatives have the solution for all of them. And then you and I worked, and we noticed that the MP doesn't have the solutions. The MP has the influence to be able to activate the solutions, but the actual activation comes from someone else. So you keep putting pressure, and the NGOs and the community leaders keep putting pressure on you. But until and unless you are not improving the administrative system, it's going to be very hard, even if you mobilize and organize, more marginalized and vulnerable sections to have their voices.
Right. No, thanks, Ritvika. Rajesh, I think sort of again picking on the point that Ritvika made, eh, to be almost convenient in my question, is there an inclusivity toolkit? Uh, I know this is a lot of it will be context specific, but in terms of principles or in terms of practices, are there certain approaches that you think um, that should be sort of more, we should be more mindful of in the planning of our cities?
I don't think there is an inclusivity toolkit, but I think there are spaces of inclusivity, right? Like meaning, instead of thinking about it in a perhaps in an engineering methodology as a toolkit, maybe we should think more in an architectural metaphor of creating spaces that are inclusive by design, right? So we actually just recently tried out one of our first such experiments. We call it Janta Ka Faisla, where migrants from Chhattisgarh, um, the gaze was inverted. So instead of migrants being, so say in a Jansan Wai, you will have a bureaucrat, like people who are in positions of power, hearing representations from people who are supplicants, right? And migrants are typically in that supplicant role. What we did is we reversed that, and um, and in the Janta Ka Faisla, it is the migrants who sit as a jury, and they hear representations from people who are typically in positions of power, right, or of epistemic authority, professors and academics and people like that. Um, in terms of a principle, a great one, and this is one that I use all the time. It's not mine at all, or even Socrates's. It's John Rawls's great idea of the veil of ignorance, right? Which is that often, when you make decisions, you should deliberately engineer it in such a way that you don't know who you are going to be when the policy is enacted, right? And so, if you can take on, so instead of being you, a person of power or wealth, you could be a Dalit or you could be a Muslim, and therefore a policy should be enacted in such a way that you are, you would be assigned a role that is perhaps not your current role. And so we can create so design, I think, plays a huge role in this. I also want to give a little history lesson. I mean, after all, the kind of things that we take for granted as social institutions, secret ballot voting, were actually created by scientists and thinkers 250 years ago, right? And so I think in this kind of very, very wicked world that we are in, we need to very carefully and explicitly design institutions that are inclusive and using principles like the veil of ignorance in them.
And so if I can sort of quickly follow up on that question, just in terms of your experience with Janta Ka Faisla,
Mhm.
what apart from this initiative not existing before, in the sense that you were able to bring this forth, did you have the support of all the stakeholders that were relevant, like the government and say some of the other people who are important to get something like this to actually scale up?
Absolutely. In fact, and I think that again, we want to design spaces that are not adversarial, right? And Janta Ka Faisla is not meant to be an adversarial space. It's meant to be a representational space. And so we did get buy-in from all the major stakeholders. But I mean, that is also contextual. It may not be the case everywhere, right?
No, thanks, Rajesh. Divya, a quick question on when we think about what are some of the issues that the marginalized face. I think one of them that always ends up being right on top is entitlements and access to social sector schemes. Portability has always been an issue. Ability to actually get these schemes at the last mile is an issue. Jivika has been working in some of these spaces for a while. Is technology an enabler in some of these things? Is social media technology, are some of these things enablers, or or do we need to really do it do it the hard way, which is to the grassroots approach, and try and get this advocacy going over a period of time, and then maybe over some years we begin to see some changes? What do you think is working in this space right now?
Sure, that's a really important question. I think in terms of some of the most pressing issues that migrants are facing right now with respect to say registration of or portability of entitlements. So all of these questions, I think there is always a tendency from the side of the government and the policymakers to try and just solve it through technology. That it's always thought of as this magic bullet that can come in. It's not even. I mean, I think you in your question you framed it as the enabler, but I think in the government systems, it's not even thought of as the enabler. It's thought of as the answer or the solution to a lot of these problems. So, for example, in our experience, if we talk about portability, like lack of access to subsidized ration or even just basic food, nutritious food, was one of the most pressing issues that migrant workers faced last year, and it all came to the spotlight very clearly how the lack of portability of ration cards from rural areas to urban areas was really one of the critical kind of impediments in their lives. But now, what is the solution? The solution is this one nation, one ration card that the government has introduced, which is a great idea in theory. But at least in our experience in Gujarat, we're really struggling to really implement it on the ground because I think even though technology might be in place, I think some of the other sort of critical enablers like getting the buy-in of all stakeholders, instilling trust among the community with the system. All of these things have to be really in place before we finally bring in that element of technology. Because, for example, there is a lot of pushback from the ration shop dealers in the source villages because their quota is getting cut if the migrants start to access ration in the cities. So the fair price owners in the villages are threatening migrants that if you don't take ration from our shops, we will cut your ration card, will be blocked, and you will not be able to use the ration card to avail of any entitlements in the villages, in the rural areas. And for the communities that we work with who really go back and forth between villages, who are not aspiring to settle down permanently in the cities, depriving them of an address proof in the village, it really makes a big difference. So that there's no trust in the system, there's no buy-in from the stakeholders. So I think all of these things are really have to be in place before we finally kind of bring in the element of technology. The second example is that of registration of migrant workers and other unorganized sector workers. So people like us have been initiating pilot experiments on the ground, in terms of using simple apps to register workers, and the main objective is to seed this to a larger database whenever that database is active. So recently the Supreme Court has issued guidelines saying that this needs to be, this needs to come out fairly soon, but it hasn't been operational as yet. But then again, a lot of the tendency is for the registration process to be completely digitized, completely digital. So there are no offline pathways for some communities as vulnerable as migrant workers to really access them, and that just exacerbates the kind of inequalities that are already there in the system. So I think thinking through some of these inequities before bringing in technology is really critical.
Got it. No, thanks, Divya. Tikendra, I want to go back to my first question. You were you're suddenly elected. You're now the deputy mayor of Shimla, and
It's not suddenly. It took lots
yeah, of course. I
lots
mean,
of effort in work. Yeah.
after a lot of effort,
Yeah.
you're finally in the city government.
Yeah.
Two or three questions. Number one, Shimla is an ecologically, environmentally sensitive city. So the first question is, I think a number of initiatives that you took was really about trying to get citizens to be actually interested and engaged on some of these issues. So I want to get maybe a little bit about how you managed to do that, because I think citizen engagement is at the core of actually getting marginalized to have a say in some of these things. And second, of course, municipal budgets has always been a contentious issue for several years now, several decades, maybe not just years. And there's always back and forth between city governments, state government, central government. We've not figured the devolution of funds in the most easy manner. So two questions there. How did you address some of these issues, and what were some of the challenges that you faced?
So yeah, I think Nandan, we've been fortunate enough in Simla because there this consciousness about eco environment is quite ingrained, and it has happened over the past several decades, I would say, and being conditioned. So you'll find in Simla, if you go into the mall, we get people from Delhi and all would come and spit on the road. There would be someone from Simla say, "Oh, no, please don't do that." And if you come and fag, I mean, smoke, they'll say, please don't smoke, and else you'll be fined. So, we had that additional advantage. And how we were able to further strengthen it, I would say, consolidate it is by, further proactively kind of stepping off our foot, because there are definitely gaps in it. And I'll just share two anecdotes with you. So that how, because I'm really fond of hearing those anecdotal experiences. So once I got a call midnight, okay, and this guy was a judge of the High Court, and he said, "Look, you are sleeping, and your administration is hand in glove with these forest mafia, and they've just chopped down a tree." I said, "The first part is correct, sir, because this is the time to sleep." But to say that we are hand in glove is not. You shouldn't take it that as true. And I asked my officer, imagine midnight. I took my DFO. We have the forest was under the municipal corporation, and we went to the site. And this guy was so clever. Who had chopped down the tree. They were not even twigs. Forget about no sawdust, because he was an expert in that. Because that's how you claim those spaces, no? Right in the city. We were able to find out after hard work, because this officer was also good. He said, "Sir, this is the place where the tree was cut." And not to name the person, but the guy who owned that property happened to be a former minister, okay, of the government. But under the laws are slightly stringent. I filed an FIR, and I told the chief minister that, "Look, I'm not going to spare," because he said, "Don't spare." So, the kind of messages you send and then we created a task team whereby if we find people dumping muck in the forest land, then they will find heavily. And the execution took place. And I think we generated some 5 to 6 crores by just finding people dumping in the midnight, there, though they were designated. So I think the consciousness was already there. What we did is we further consolidated that and implemented it in a more democratic manner, that whatever was collected is a fine, okay? Because the forest team had to be awake whole night. 10% would go to them as a dividend. So, okay, so if there's a fine of 20,000, so you can also take 2,000. But, the point was that we were able to bring in a kind of new nuance, kind of nuances. So, yeah, forest, that's why you find 55 to 60% of the town still has that urban forest, and of course that was how the Britishers had developed that town. So I think it is quite ingrained. We just tried to build layers on top of it, and we never compromised. Like, in fact, our mayor was like really ridiculed for that. And in fact, he was criticized because he was very stringent. He was the tree authority chairperson and would hardly give a permission to chop down a tree, only if it is very dangerous. So, the kind of consciousness that you build, and then the structures that you build down below, in consonance with the people, and people would call you immediately. Look, there's something happening, and the team used to. But the worst part is, I mean, that is another catch. Once the chief minister, of course, allowed, and then later the urban forest was taken over back from the municipal corporation to